Thank you, Gay. And in terms of your interesting remarks about Black History Month, I want to note that Jacksonville also claims A. Philip Randolph, as well as James Weldon Johnson. And it occurred to me in terms of my remarks this morning that I might extend my beginning a little bit by noting that perhaps we will have a history that tells all our history to all of our children and all of our history classes when we are a more united States of America than we seem to be at present. Because I was going to note in beginning my talk that many of my neighbors who would like to make America great again, I think would like us to go back to the America of John Wayne. So for them, one of the values and models for what America should be might well be going under the name True Grit, but with a little different connotation for what I want us to look at this morning. In the movie True Grit, with an eye patch on it, made right around the worst times of the 1960s, John Wayne represented that icon of Western individualism, the individual as rugged hero, the kind of toughness that we might, in the eyes of some, need to get back to. But I want, however much value there may be in those elements of character, I want to get at another element of grit, another aspect of it, and in a deeper way, I want to get at a different sense of the truth of grit. Because those of us who don't look to myth, and to nationalist myths in particular for our sources of truth and wisdom, may look in part to science. And when we look to science, we may look to the social sciences, including psychology, for how to understand ourselves as human beings and what we're capable of and what limits us and how we might, in fact, realize more of our potential. And so I want to speak today to an element of true grit that draws on the truth of the science of psychology, that draws on our understanding in reasoned, not mythological terms, at least not entirely mythological terms, in a reasoned way about who we are and what we're capable of. And so I'll refer a lot to two different books. One of them is by Martin Seligman, who's been called the father of positive psychology. And his 2011 book, Flourish, is one of the things that I thought was one of the most brilliant books I'd read in decades, and that I tout particularly to people who are in the field and may utilize those things and pass them on. And then after that, Angela Duckworth's bestseller called Grit, The Power and Passion of Perseverance. So positive psychology stems from Martin Seligman's experience when he came into psychology, that especially at the mid-20th century, it was creeping through the 60s, it seemed that psychology was preoccupied with either of two reductionisms. Either the Freudian tradition that reduces the ego of our experience to something that's caught between a powerful id and a powerful superego we've internalized from forces outside us, which takes a realistic and pessimistic view of human possibility, and instead of looking forward, traces everything to what in our past caused what. Or the other great force of mid-20th century and beyond psychology, the behaviorist school, which, modeling itself on the hard sciences, wanted to talk only about what was measurable, predictable, and what could fall under the categories of scientific validity. And what that meant for human beings was cause and effect in the form of stimulus and response. For the behaviorist, if you want to understand anything about human life, understand what the stimuli are, measure the connections between stimulus and response, and that will yield as complete an account of human behavior and of human beings as we're entitled to claim. Well, Martin Seligman thought that this was, in short, ridiculous, and that it did not get at what was human about us, and in fact he might well, in referring to the phrase positive psychology, have been drawing on the great humanists of the 1940s and 50s and 60s, people like Abe Maslow, people like Carl Rogers, people like Erich Fromm, people like Viktor Frankl, who came out of a concentration camp, convinced that it's by meaning that we have to find a way to live. And that psychology has to focus on what what enables us to find meaning to go on in our lives. What Seligman noted was that there was a particular time, I believe in 1936, when the heads of the departments of Princeton, Harvard, and Penn were meeting and decided that psychology, to be a hard science, needed to focus on research and not on applied science, and that everything from there was, the die was cast. Everybody fell in line. What's interesting to me about Martin Seligman, in contradistinction to my heroes of humanistic psychology, who I just mentioned, what's interesting to me is that he has remained an empirical psychologist. He's remained interested in those same research methodologies that scientists look to sort out what is merely an intuition or a plausible explanation from something that will carry the cash value of scientific evidence and of data. And so Seligman, in turning his attentions to human flourishing, in turning his attentions to what not only will constitute a way beyond a neurosis or something like that, he had thought that as a clinician, if he was able to help, occasionally at least, help a patient overcome anxiety, depression, and other symptoms of that sort of neurosis, that he would have a healthy, happy patient. And he found that he would sometimes at least have a patient who wasn't sick anymore, but that he didn't end up with patients who were happy and satisfied and flourishing. He ended up with what he called an empty patient. And so it's a different way of looking when we shift that focus to what is it in us that makes for well-being. What is it that makes for a feeling that our lives mean something, or even within that, that we're successful in life, that we're accomplishing something that is worth accomplishing. And so I might say that, I won't say false grit, I'll say apparent grit, okay? Going back to Plato's distinction, not between the true and the false, between real truth and what merely appears to be, okay? And I'll say that in some ways, the John Wayne grit isn't true grit. It's apparent grit. It is indeed a kind of toughness. It's toughness. It is indeed character. It does indeed have tremendous values in many social settings. But if we look to the science of perseverance at things that matter over time, if we look to what Angela Duckworth calls the power and passion of perseverance, then true grit involves much more than just toughness, more than self-discipline, more than just persevering. It involves the passion for what we're persevering in. As I poppies a bunch for this microphone, right, Kirby? So, in order to truly understand the kind of grit that's meaningful for positive psychology, we can't just say, stick with it, tough it out, don't be a quitter. We can't just use the old school tough love moralisms. We have to look to what's love in the tough love too. We have to look at what you're doing and why you're doing it. We have to look at why you're on that in the first place. In other words, if it's something you're going to stick to, shouldn't it be something that you have a passion for? Shouldn't it be because there's something about what resonates with you that you want to commit to something as an unfolding of your life? So I would say in simplistic terms, what many conservatives get right about character is that character is critical to human flourishing, and that if we lack discipline, perseverance, if we lack the ability to go past the obstacles, to be resilient, to keep pursuing our dreams, then we will not realize what we're capable of as human beings. We will not be what we can be, and we will not bring to the world what we're capable of bringing to the world. The conservatives are right about that. And I simplify, but I think most of you follow what I'm talking about. The conservatives are right that permissiveness is not the way to get people to fulfill what they're capable of. The conservatives are right that if a parent says to her child, well, at least you tried, over and over without the expectation, in the same way that if a parent never disciplines a child, an adolescent, if we don't do that with each other as adults, we don't challenge ourselves, and so we don't get the growth that people are capable of. What I'm simplifying is a conservative point of view is absolutely right about that. But let me come back to the flip side, because I work with teens and have for 20 years, and a whole lot of my teens are homeschooled. And some of my teens are unschooled, meaning that their parents let them read whatever they want, research whatever they want. And a conservative would say, that is horrible. They'll never know Thackeray. Whoever Thackeray is. There's some great elements of the Western canon that these young people will not understand. Well, my God, we can't have that, can we? So part of what we talk about when we talk about American history is who measures what's great, right? Is Sonia Sanchez, homegirls and hand grenades on the same par as Tennyson? Well, not according to all the critics, but that's a different story. So what I want to suggest is, in terms of the science of grit, what the parents of my homeschooled youth are doing is encouraging them to play where necessary, to discover where their passions are, and at the same time to keep at it so that they're developing the ability to have that stick-to-itiveness, to cultivate the characteristics of grit for the passion that is meaningful to them. So I might say, in terms of my divided America, that if we want America to be great in a way that's not just the past and not just some liberal mirage of a future, but that draws on our traditional values and at the same time creates the potential for us being something greater than we've been so far. And I need a drink of water if I'm going to finish that sentence. Then part, I think, of what we can draw on is how we need to bring together the intuitive truth of both sides of that equation. That we can be encouraging people to be in touch with who they are. We can say the Joseph Campbell mantra, follow your bliss. And at the same time, we can say the conservative rules like don't be a quitter. We can have both sides of that if we bring them all together. And that really is what Angela Duckworth is doing in her analysis of grit, is talking about all the elements that we need to bring together to do that. As Martin Seligman pointed out, reward and punishment don't just shape behavior. Reward and punishment shape character. And so positive psychology, in fact, better than behaviorism, far better than behaviorism, can recognize that character is a real thing in us and something that we need to attend to. At the same time, we can realize this is something, for instance, that if you're a parent working with a youth, if you're a teacher working with students, it helps to be aware that compared to intelligence or IQ or other predictors that are based on measures of what I'm capable of doing, self-discipline outpredicts intelligence 2 to 1 and outpredicts IQ 2 to 1 in terms of what people will accomplish. It just so happens culturally that reliance on test scores, which tend to correlate more with IQ than with these other factors, reliance on test scores over-rewards boys and punishes girls in terms of the factors that they bring to the elements of their success through high school and college. So if we recognize the importance of that self-discipline, what do you do with somebody like me who's real smart but attention deficit disorder? You work on it, don't you? And so I have a lot of work to do on the discipline part. And one of the things that we learn from coaching, there's an expression, I'll probably get this wrong when I do it, is that You coach to your weaknesses, you train your weaknesses and race to your strengths. And so the more I can train to what my weaknesses are, the stronger I'm going to be in realizing my potential. So grit is something that relies on this combination of a passion for a life goal and at the same time this perseverance to struggle through those setbacks. The premise that Angela Duckworth has, she was challenged, Seligman, who was her advisor in graduate school, told her at one point after she developed all kinds of interesting things, he said, but you don't have a theory. And she cried over that and came back and said, all right, here's my theory. Talent times effort equals skill. Okay? You start with a talent that's roughly innate, and you practice, you develop it, you've developed your talent, now it's a skill. Now you have a skill. How good are you at that? You're a basketball player, you're a football player, you're a cellist, whatever. So skill times effort equals achievement. The more effort you spend practicing that skill, the more you'll achieve. Notice that effort comes in twice. Effort counts twice. It's a multiplier of your talent, it's a multiplier of your skill. And so that plugging along effort stuff is going to be much more important for your outcomes than IQ or some other factor that you might feel, well, I'll never do that, I'll never be capable of that. Because any of us can be, with the right coaching and encouragement, capable of effort. Even what we think of as innate isn't necessarily so. For instance, I grew up believing that IQ was pretty fixed over a lifetime, but there were studies that used different interventions with youth, aged 14 to 18, and they found that they could actually, through those interventions, raise people's IQs between 14 and 18, as standard intelligence measures would happen. They could raise subscores for mathematics or for English comprehension. And so even those thought to be innate characteristics of intelligence can be modified with the wise application of effort. In the nuts and bolts of the development of grit, there's something that Duckworth refers to as deliberate practice, which has a lot of sub-elements, and it's like the grinding away, intentional, day-to-day stuff. And when she did a survey of people who were in national spelling bees, her sample of spellers rated that this deliberate practice was more effortful than the other things they were doing, and it was less enjoyable. But when she looked at the very best spellers in that sample, yes, they found it was more effortful, but they found that it was more enjoyable. So she says one possibility is that the more these people practice, the more these people do it, the more enjoyable it becomes. I find more plausible her other hypothesis that the people who can enjoy the challenge of that are the people who are going to rise to the top. Because again, with much of this we get the correlation and the what's the chicken and what's the egg question is part of the interpretation for that. So just as in academic accomplishment, grit counts for more than intelligence. Just as those who do the most and do the best actually enjoy most what's in there. The best state of all is one that was represented in a 1990 book by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi called flow. And that's when you have so absorbed all those micro skills, all those little pieces of muscle memory are so well integrated through your years of practice that you become Air Jordan. You become the great one skating to where the puck is going to be and not where it is right now. You become Brady to Gronk in terms of today's Super Bowl, right? So that instead of being effortful, it is effortless. That, to me, is the state that any of us would love to achieve. Imagine if me stepping into the pulpit today was not a matter of, I've got to get my words out exactly right, or no one is going to get this. And imagine if I'd spent so many years absorbing this stuff that I could just walk up here and bam, speak for ragged notes like this and come across cleanly and beautifully? Well, I'm not quite there, but still, we get some sense of what flow is like, right? Flow to me is mindfulness in action. Flow to me is the zen of being where you are, as opposed to the effort of having to get there. Flow to me is the Tao of perfection in the living of life. Wonderful, good stuff. So, what about the blockages that we run up against? What about the barriers? What about the obstacles? If I'm in a flow state, if I'm Air Jordan, and all of a sudden, here is Dikine Mutombo standing with his arm outstretched just as I'm about to the basket, hopefully I have some wonderful improvisation in that moment that follows from all my practice and all my stuff. And that is not just a matter of being a natural. That's a matter of all the different experiences I've encountered before, right? But there are some things that are like that basketball center blocking us, that loom larger in our life and come up earlier and in a harder way. And sometimes we talk about that in terms of trauma. There are things that happen to people that can mess us up. There are things that are not just challenges, but things that can shake us to our foundation. So what do we do with that? We're very accustomed in our culture to being aware of post-traumatic stress. But Seligman says that much more common is post-traumatic resiliency. And we don't hear as much about that. And he talks about how we can cultivate that resiliency. And he has even more interesting things to say about people who have experienced trauma and have been through it. You might think of John McCain as a recently deceased American hero. John McCain, who was held and tortured in a North Vietnamese, not even prison really, I guess, for years. And he was indeed a remarkable, heroic example, even though he was caught. Pace Presidentia. Interestingly to me, there was a study that 61% of imprisoned airmen tortured by the North Vietnamese, not just John McCain, 61% said they had benefited psychologically from their ordeal. Isn't that something? More than half said they had benefited psychologically. Now, I want to say that is not just any cohort of a study. Those are people who made it through to the point where they did everything to become a pilot at a level that was that. That was a special group of people to begin with. That's what I want to say, okay? But that said, there's a basis for that. There was another study that kind of went back to Seligman's work with rats in the 60s, because Seligman, when he studied helplessness, and he found that when we took a control group and we took different kinds of rats, or the similar rats, and did different things with them, if we had rats that we submitted shocks to, and they had to do certain things to make the shock stop, okay? Those are the escapable rats. There was a way of them getting out of that shock if they could figure it out, okay? Then there was another group of rats, the inescapable rats. Nothing they did would change how long that shock lasted, okay? So what Seligman found was that the rats that basically learned that there's a way out of this, that they developed what we would call resiliency. And so when they encountered further obstacles, they would keep trying. But the rats who basically figured out there's nothing I can do about it, when they were put in terms of a new obstacle, they just kind of lie down and shiver and wait for it to be done. If they were supposed to swim a while, they would drown. And so A newer study went back and said, what if we, instead of using adult rats, what if we used adolescent rats? And here's what they studied. They did the same kinds of experiments, and now they had two groups of rats besides the control. They had the rats that had learned resiliency. There is something you can do when you're being shot. And the rats who basically learned there's nothing you can do. And then they took those two groups and exposed them to the same stuff. What they found was that if a rat in its adolescence had been trained with resiliency, if a rat was imbued with that internal sense, and of course rat innards in the spiritual sense are not what behaviorists had looked for, right? But if the rat's worldview as an adolescent rat is I can beat this, then you come back later with something you can't beat, and they're going to keep at it anyway. Because it's going to take a lot of outer world experience to defeat what they have inside them. That is big stuff. That is a huge learning. That says that if we have the right ways of bringing up our youth, we can make ourselves tougher, stronger, more resilient, and able to overcome almost anything. So one example that Duckworth gives of characteristics that correlate with grit, more than academic this, that, or the other, if a high school student, for instance, or middle school into high school, when students have at least 2 years sustained involvement in an extracurricular activity, that correlates with that kind of grit, with that kind of follow-through, with that kind of stick-to-itiveness. So what are we doing? A recent study found that over decades, affluent students have about the same level of involvement in extracurricular activities. But we all know that people in poor neighborhoods who go to schools that have failing grades don't have time for art and music. That what they need is more drilling in the basics of school. And so it turns out there's a precipitous drop in participation of that kind by students who are from less affluent backgrounds. In other words, the very things that we think might be helpful in taking the people who have less academic achievement may be undermining the conditions that let them over the course of a lifetime overcome the very difficult conditions that they're in the first place. So I think there are huge lessons to be found in post-traumatic resiliency and in the ingredients of that. The importance of that really can't be estimated. It's hard for me to state how important that is. Resilience also correlates with optimism, and optimism correlates with health. There was one study in terms of cancer that was done with rats, and 50% of the control group died. But of the rats that we would have considered by their behavioral measures to be pessimistic rats, 75% of them died. The ones that would be measured as optimistic rats, only 25% died. And the same with humans as well. There was a study in the Netherlands in the 90s that the death rate of people who basically had scored as optimists, the death rate of the study was 55% less than it was, or I'm sorry, it was only 55% of what it was overall for the people who were pessimists. And when it came to cardiovascular disease, the death rate for the optimists was only 23% over the course of the study of what the death rate was for the pessimists. And when we talk about optimists and pessimists, we're not just talking about mood we can control for depression. Mood made no difference. People who said, I feel happy this often, that had nothing to do with it. It was about our belief in the future. It was our commitment and belief that the future could be a good thing, as opposed to resignation. That was the critical difference. As a matter of fact, and I found this stunning, this is a quote from Seligman, we estimate that being in the upper quartile of optimism that is top 25% in terms of how optimistic, seems to have the beneficial effect on cardiovascular risk roughly equivalent to not smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. Isn't that incredible? Being an optimist versus a pessimist, 2 packs of cigarettes a day. So in terms of the grit stuff, I want to kind of move toward my ending by coming back to that. At one point, Ms. Duckworth went back to a swim coach that she had gotten all kinds of input from about what are the elements of this and the practice and the performance and everything else. She said, do you still believe all that? He said, oh yeah, but I left out the most important thing. The real way, he's talking about what are the elements of grit, okay? He says, the real way to become a great swimmer is to join a great team. Now let's go back to the John Wayne individualist myth, okay? On the John Wayne individualist myth, the only way we understand a great swim team is these are the toughest people. We have an attrition model, only the toughest and the best get through. But that's not what this swim coach is saying. The swim coach is saying, yeah, some of that's true about the people that are on the team in the first place, but you may not be a great swimmer. You get onto a great team, you're going to act like a great swimmer. You're going to aspire to be a great swimmer. We see this stuff in all the statistics about teaching, in terms of mainstreaming students, in terms of who the students have in their classrooms with them, in terms of what the expectations are. It applies in so many ways. You want to be a great anything, be on a team, join a team that's great at that. Okay? In the ideology of self-interest, in the mentality of the selfish gene, you want to breed hens that lay the most eggs? Here's what you do. You take the hen that lays the most eggs. You pick her, you breed, you breed, you breed. You keep selecting for the hen that lays the most eggs. And after 6 generations, you're going to see a result. And you know what you do see a result? The result you see is that those hens peck themselves to pieces and you don't get many eggs because they're so aggressive. The traits that correlate with that hen laying more eggs result in an aggressiveness that in a collection of hens leads them to tear each other to pieces. Does that sound anything like any neighborhood you know of? So what you do is you take the entire clutch of hens that laid the most eggs and you breed that clutch. And you do that for generations and you do in fact get more eggs. What this says scientifically is that it is not the individual's attributes that define the outcome at a collective level. Our collective well-being as communities is not a function of our individual well-beings added up. It's something else in how we are with each other. Darwin said, a tribe including many members who were always ready to aid one another and to sacrifice themselves for the common good would be victorious over most other tribes. And this would be natural selection. Not at the level of the selfish gene, but at the level of the community. And I say, in terms of that our world is a lot like those hens that tore each other apart. Our world on the realist view of self-interest and of an individualist free market philosophy is one in which the affluent kids grow grittier and the poor kids are ever more at risk. And all we need to do if we're hiring is hire the rich kids who came out the best, or even better, the poor kids who came out the best, because the ones who make it through that must really be special. And I want to suggest that our justice work is so important for all these lives that part of our purpose and our meaning is that work for those people who have less and need more, whose opportunities have already been thwarted, but who are not incapable and who have not reached the end of what they can do. I want to suggest, in fact, that if you want to follow that principle, of join a great team. You might imagine a handful of people in a rural Florida county that has a vision for liberal religion and social justice, has a vision of being deeply supportive and caring. You might link that up with the awareness that in Latin, to compete is derived quite literally from something that means to strive together. That competition even is a togetherness of the sort that we can engage in. And also something that we can use now as a group and in our individual lives whenever we may find ourselves with someone who is struggling. We can be evangels of hope. We can be evangels of learned optimism, of resiliency. We can echo the voice of one teacher that Angela Duckworth quoted, or one volunteer who said to the student, not, this is all you can do, but who knows what you are capable of. Thank you.